This is Salim bin Muhammad Rafi, your host, and here is my YouTube channel, Zamir Universal. The world peace is on fire. The human cries are touching the heavens, and the nature's wrath is in the waiting in the form of earthquake, tsunami, or they be severe either famine. Since the human cruelty cast on innocent women and children of Palestine and Gaza, cornered now as hyena, a group of hyenas, get a small cub of lion and attack him, or a sick lion attack, and they finally get him down and kill him. It is exactly the way you find these Jews of Israel. Now, why people hate them, why people dig up their graves, spit on them, and they have a deep down contempt. And they are the only nation for thousands of years who have been thrown out of many countries, more than 70 countries, many more than once, because of their intrigues. They lie, they cheat, they fleece you, they kill you, they laugh at you, they dance at you, they dance at misery, and they take pride in killing innocent and elderly, sick, and the way they have destroyed the whole healthcare system in Gaza, I think is a typical example why Adolf Hitler hated them and burned them in the incinerators and put them in the gas chambers. As a human being, I do not wish that he should have done that. But imagine now when you see the IDFs laughing, dancing, kicking, blindfolding, stripping them, and throwing them out of their own homes. And for the last 75 years, this is a continuous saga. And now this mad, schizophrenic, maniac is the most hated person, Netanyahu, on earth, with the hypocrisy and double standard and lies and support of the, at the moment, the most weakest and the most corrupt president of United States. And in the last 6 or 7, you will find anybody who stood for justice and peace was either blamed for a rape and impeached, or was shot in the head like JFK. Now, everybody knows about impeachment of Clinton, and everybody knows about Nixon, and everybody knows that whoever ever raised voice for just solution of Palestine, which was created by Americans and the Great Britain together, gathered the scum of the society in the forms of immigrants, starved, with sunken eyes, barefooted, almost naked, and fed. But they didn't. They occupied their land and they pushed them out. And look at the extent of cruelty from north of Gaza to south, and from south to Raffa. And now see what they are doing to a small, tiny town of Rafah across and at the border between Egypt and Israel. And none at the moment in 2024, in the month of February, has any conscience. The Muslims, Christians, Arabs, alike, playing politics and the living in a delusion that if they do nothing if they sit together. It's like suffering from a fatigue syndrome, that this matter has been there for the last 75 years. So if we just close our eyes, like the pigeon facing a cat who is going to eat the pigeon, and he closes his eyes that there is no cat, and finally the cat eats him. It's exactly the way the world is doing towards this madman, this crazy man, this scum of the society, the one who has no right to destroy the peace. And he has no right. He should be given the maximum punishment. And normal death will be no punishment for this man. He has to pay back to his creator and have a miserable demise from this world. And so such a scum of this society, unless they go and nature takes care of them, there will never be ever a peace in this world. Every now and then you find a criminal, a war criminal, a person who has maganomelia, who's abnormal in the head, hating so much and getting joy by doing things. And look at the lies he has created. And always, the Jews always lie. And you can see that even the small percentage of good Jews who are religious and who are as good and as honest as any other person, Muslim or Christian or any other religion. But they overwhelmed by these liars. They fabricated that they have rescued one 60-year-old and one 70-year-old from Raffa in an apartment building. These liars, and God take care of their lies and punish them in the deepest pits of hell. They knew it about February the 2nd. At least
the world is watching a famine develop in Gaza that could kill many times more than the 24,000 Palestinians who've already perished in Israel's merciless blitzkrieg. By early February, if nothing changes, more than 500,000 people could be in a catastrophic state of hunger. These are not the projections of the Palestinian Health Ministry, dismissed by much of the European media as Hamas run, but by the Integrated Food Security Phase classification, drawing on data from UN agencies and NGOs. Of course, the US, Britain and Germany is doing much more than just watching a humanitarian catastrophe develop in Gaza. They're actively feeding the Israeli military machine, which is creating it. Yediot Ahronot, an Israeli newspaper with good government sources, reported that since the 7th of October, the US has sent 230 cargo planes and 20 ships filled with artillery shells, armoured vehicles and combat gear. Much of this gear is going through the British airport of RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus, which is only 40 minutes flying time from Tel Aviv. This quantity of arms is at odds with American rhetoric, which, by the way, America is good at. Asked by the New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman whether Muslim and Christian lives were worth less than Jewish lives, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken responded in a voice cracked with emotion.
No. Period. For me, I think for so many of us, what we're seeing every single day in Gaza is gut-wrenching. And the suffering we're seeing among innocent men, women, and children breaks my heart. The question is, what is to be done?
He deserves an Oscar for his performance. What is to be done? Blinken asks. How about calling for an immediate ceasefire, which after 13 weeks of bombing, the US still refuses to do? How about stopping the supply of US shells and bombs? How about backing the South African claim that this is genocide, or at the very least war crimes? Israel's bombing of Gaza has been so intense that it has been on the verge of running out of ammo. Israel has dropped almost 30,000 bombs and shells on Gaza in 100 days, 8 times more than the US dropped on Iraq in 6 years of war. It's even worse than that. Blinken is supplying Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, with the weapons he needs to defy US policy for a two-state solution. Splits are now emerging in Israeli war cabinet. Gabi Eisenkot said that.
Welcome to The Journalist. The Middle East region has turned into a living hell. Iran's plans to attack U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria with its armed proxies. Israel's war with Hamas in Gaza. The tension created by the Houthis in Yemen in the Red Sea. All of these have brought tensions in the region to its peak. Nowadays, striking news about the war between Israel and Hamas, which is seen as one of the most important cornerstones in resolving the crisis in the region, has started to come to the agenda. It was reported that the effects of the war, which reached from the southern Gaza Strip to Egypt's Rafah settlement borders in recent days, caused a great tension in the region today. Regional sources said that Egypt issued a warning to Israel that an IDF attack on Rafah on the Gaza-Egypt border would force Gazan civilians into Egypt, leading to Egypt's withdrawal from the peace treaty it signed with Israel in 1979. Immediately after these warnings, Egypt launched a very remarkable preparatory phase in the Rafah border area. Large numbers of Egyptian troops began pouring into the area. Let's go to the most critical center of the war and discover the full impact of Egypt's preparations on the Israel-Hamas war, the latest developments in the region, and what we can expect in the coming days. We have already mentioned that immediately after Egypt's withdrawal from the peace treaty it signed with Israel in 1979, there was a great deal of activity in Rafah. The details of this activity became much clearer shortly afterwards today. It was reported that the Egyptian army recently deployed various elements of the 3rd Field Army's 4th Armored Division, consisting of more than 40 M1A1 Abrams and M60A3 Patton main battle tanks, as well as YPR 765 infantry fighting vehicles, to the border with Egypt. The deployment comes ahead of the expansion of Israeli military operations around the southern Gaza city of Rafah. Here, a large part of the population was seeking security, and fears grew in Egypt that Palestinians would be forced out of the enclave en masse. Egypt's deployment is therefore likely to provide extra border security for Israel's eventual ground operation against the southern Gaza Strip and Rafah city, which could result in an influx of Palestinian refugees into Egypt. Following these tense moments in Rafah, it became clear that Egypt's deployment of its army to the border was followed by a move from Israel. The IDF Air Force announced that they were targeting Hamas members in Rafah. Netanyahu's office said in a statement that the army had been ordered to develop a plan to evacuate civilians from Rafah and destroy 4 Hamas battalions it said were stationed there. Netanyahu did not provide details or a timetable for the Israeli attack, but the announcement sparked widespread panic. Following the attack, Netanyahu this week declared that Rafah and Khan Yunis are the last 2 strongholds of Hamas. These statements raise the possibility that Israel might target Rafah again in the future. In the context of these possibilities, Egypt has started to tighten security measures along the borderlines. Since the outbreak of the war between Israel and Hamas, following the deadly attack on October 7th, Egypt had already built a concrete border wall 6 meters deep and covered with barbed wire. Now, with tensions in the region at their peak, security sources report that Egypt is also building embankments at border outposts and increasing surveillance. Meanwhile, Egypt's state intelligence service has detailed some of the measures it has taken on its border in response to Israeli allegations that Hamas is smuggling weapons through Egypt. It said that 3 rows of barriers along the border make it possible to smuggle above or below ground. Images shared on social media by the Sinai Foundation for Human Rights, an independent group, appeared to show that the wall was built in December and now has multiple embankments behind it. In later photos, which the group said were taken in early February, it was clear that 3 vertical layers of coiled barbed wire had been laid on top of the wall. Satellite imagery from January and December also showed some new construction along the 13-kilometer border near Rafah and the presence of a wall at its northern end extending to the seaside. Approaching the Rafah crossing with Gaza, the remains of destroyed houses could be seen, as well as kilometers of concrete walls along roads parallel to the sea and near the border. The new measures come after security was beefed up in northern Sinai as the Egyptian army consolidated its grip on the insurgency that escalated a decade ago. Long before the current war in Gaza began, Egypt announced that it had destroyed the tunnels through which smuggling into Gaza had previously flourished and cleared a buffer zone near the border. Now Egypt stands ready to...
Hello, I'm Tanya Beckett. President Biden has appealed for the more than 1 million Palestinians sheltering in Rafah in the southern Gaza Strip to be protected, once again urging Israel not to carry out a big assault without a credible plan for the safety of civilians. He was speaking after meeting the Jordanian monarch, King Abdullah, in Washington. The king has repeatedly pushed for a full truce to end the conflict that started when Hamas attacked Israel on October the 7th. On Monday morning, a series of Israeli airstrikes there killed at least 70 people, with Israel warning of an impending ground offensive. More than half of Gaza's population now live in Rafah. The potential for a ground campaign has sparked alarm from Israel's allies, including the United States.
As the King and I discussed today, the United States is working on a hostage deal between Israel and Hamas, which would bring an immediate and sustained period of calm to Gaza for at least 6 weeks, which we could then take the time to build something more enduring.
Nearly 100,000 people have been killed, injured, or are missing. The majority are women and children. We cannot afford an Israeli attack on Rafah. It is certain to produce another humanitarian catastrophe. The situation is already unbearable for over 1 million people who have been pushed into Rafah since the war started. We cannot stand by and let this continue. We need a lasting ceasefire now. This war must end.
Well, for more analysis on King Abdullah's visit to Washington, here's our North America correspondent, Nomia Iqbal.
This was a very significant meeting in that King Abdullah is the first Arab leader to meet President Biden since October the 7th, and the king has been very open about what he thinks should be happening. And he's laid those goals out to President Biden. We heard it in his statement. He wants an immediate, long-lasting ceasefire. He also wants humanitarian aid to be sent into Gaza. He's worried about the military operation in Rafah. And he also wants a long-term solution, a two-state solution. These are all issues that President Biden has also raised. And King Abdullah is meeting President Biden where the tone has slightly changed in Washington. Last week, President Biden issued a rare rebuke of Israel in which he said the military operation in Gaza had gone over the top. Critics have pointed out that there has been no practical change, however, in America's approach. They continue to give military aid to Israel. But the king will be hoping to use his influence with America. Jordan is incredibly important as a regional ally to the Americans. The king also enjoys a very close relationship with America. He takes pride in his close relationship with President Biden, all the presidents before him. But it is a very difficult, tricky balancing act because in Jordan there has been much unrest amongst a lot of people. There's been street protests because of what's happening in Gaza, many calling on the Jordanian leadership to abandon its peace treaty with Israel, to abandon its defense agreements with America. That's not likely to happen. The king will want to use his influence. So this meeting with President Biden has been a very important roll of the dice in that sense, in order to make his feelings heard to America.
We can now cross live and speak to Dr. Alam Saleh, who is Senior Lecturer in Politics and International Relations at Australian National University, but is joining us today from Leeds in the north of England. Welcome to the programme. We've heard about the concerns from King Abdullah and also President Biden. They are by no means alone. What would be the diplomatic consequences of an assault on Rafah?
Well, definitely would have many different consequences. First of all, diplomatically speaking, it would internationalize and regionalize the conflict into Egypt, involving Egypt. That means learning from the past, Egypt knows that hundreds of thousands of refugees moving to Egypt would have security consequences, like what happened in the early 1970s when Palestinian refugees have caused and posed posed threat for Jordan internally. That means, of course, many militants might move to Egypt with the refugees, and this is something that Egypt cannot accept. Politically speaking, it would stop any kind of chance for the ceasefire. We know that the United States, Qataris, and Egyptian officials are gathering today in Cairo to discuss the 6-week ceasefire, and this would be definitely compromise such attempt. Economically speaking, this would have some economic burden for Cairo, like what happened in 2011 onwards, when hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees moved to Lebanon and Turkey. This is also something that Egypt is not ready to pay for. This is also difficult for Cairo to accept, simply because it will be very uncertain whether these refugees will be allowed to return to Gaza one day, or if any, when. So this might be very prolonged process that might undermine security, economy, and political situation of Egypt in such a war.
So this then puts added pressure on Egypt to add momentum to the peace process. What realistically can it do? What can it bring to the table?
Well, of course, it's very complicated. It's a multi-layered issue. Over 1.3 million Palestinians are gathering in an area smaller than 64 kilometers square, and this might end with a humanitarian catastrophe, of course, with a security catastrophe. But for Tel Aviv, of course, they believe that they have started a war, and if they stop it here, it would be an unfinished game, and therefore they cannot accept any kind of compromise with this part of Gaza, because they believe many militants, Hamas militants, are amongst these over 1 million people gathering in the southern part of Gaza.
Dr. Alam Saleh, thank you very much indeed.
यूनिवर्सल टेलीविजन को सब्सक्राइब करना ना भूलें, उसके बाद बेल बटन पे क्लिक करें और अपने कमेंट्स के सेक्शन में अपने कीमती जो ख्यालात का इजहार ज़रूर